Harvestella is a wonderful game all about farming, friendship, ethics, and existential dread. So, for Pride Month, I've decided I want to play the game while getting rid of one of these major aspects. Why for Pride Month specifically? You'll see soon if you haven't played the game. As for the challenge, playing a farming simulator without friends doesn't seem like much of a problem. If you've played Harvestella normally, or even experienced a game like Rune Factory, you might assume party members don't do much. However, friendship is about more than having party members. So what exactly is this run? Since I'm not allowed to have friends, I obviously cannot have any active party members. In addition to not allowing them in my party, I'm also not allowed to go through their character stories, as these can provide various benefits. And lastly, I'm not allowed to use classes gained from party members. With the rules out of the way, we can create our non-binary farmer and start a new game. We immediately wake up in the middle of quietus, a time between seasons when we breathe in that glorious airborne fiberglass. As this is obviously amazing for our health, we pass out, though the local doctor manages to find us and rudely almost blasts us with magic to try and wake us up. We then are provided with the wonderful foreshadowing of being told we should probably be dead. Oh, and we're assumed to be an amnesiac. More on that later. Right now, a weird crystal fell from the sky, and we have to deal with that. We find someone inside that we decide to help, but everyone else is being an asshole and saying we should leave this person to die. If everyone's gonna be like this, then I'm obviously not gonna be their friend. Like, there's a person dying over here. You're just gonna let that happen? Thankfully, we're allowed to take this person, and the mayor lets us stay in the empty house nearby. From here, we spend a few days being introduced to the main mechanics of the game. Stuff like farming, stamina, and basic combat. As we don't have access to friendship yet, nothing's out of the ordinary. As for story, we learn that the armored person we found is some girl. She's apparently from the future, more on that later, and needs to return to her time to solve some major calamity. Also, her name is Arya. It takes multiple in-game days before she tells you that. For now, all that matters is she's our roommate, which is a very dangerous situation if you want to avoid having friends. She does eventually leave, but going out on your own like that is bound to get you killed. I should go make sure she's safe. We follow her tracks to the Hegan Canyon, where we run into Dianthus. She's an 8-foot-tall robot lady, and I love her. She also calls us an Abel, as in the name Abel, like in the Bible. I know this is a Fire Emblem channel, but they do mean the guy in the Bible. And if you know the Bible, you know exactly where this story is gonna go. Back to the actual game though, Dianthus adds herself to our party. Thankfully, the game allows us to remove her immediately, so we don't have to fail the challenge in the first proper dungeon. And speaking of the dungeon, it's pretty easy. As our introductory dungeon, it's obviously made to ease us into the gameplay proper. Enemies are low level and weak to the abilities of our starting class. Not to mention that it's built around having only one party member. I can certainly feel that missing party member though, as party members actually do a good job of taking enemy aggro. You don't really notice that until you lose it. I was taking a lot more damage than I'm used to, but funnily enough, I didn't fully connect that to missing party members until later on. We then hit a view that tends to remind me of Xenoblade 2 and 3 before being attacked by a unicorn. This is technically a boss fight, but it's a huge joke if you're used to the combat in this game. Though that can also be attributed to this being a boss fight tutorial. Once we win, the unicorn chooses to join us before trying to teach us magic. It's through this cutscene that we unlock the mage class, which means it's probably a good time for me to talk about classes. There are 12 classes, or jobs, in the game. You start off with the Fighter class, which is a pretty standard physical class with some fire-based attacks. Almost all of the other classes in the game are obtained by making friends. 8 classes to be precise. So, what are the other 3 classes I have access to? Well, one of those is the Mage class we just got. Now, the Mage class exists in a weird gray area due to sort of obtaining it from the Unicorn, but it's also the only class obtained in a weird cutscene, and unlocking the ultimate skills for this class isn't actually tied to your friendship with the Unicorn like it would be for other classes. So I will allow the usage of the Mage class. However, it's not going to be used a lot because it requires you to stand still to attack. It really needs party members around who can aggro enemies so you don't take damage. The other 2 classes we get access to are the secret classes. The Samurai class can be obtained in Chapter 8. That's almost 40 hours of normal gameplay from now, and also the very end of the game. The other class is Aristotle, which requires completing 240 farrier quests. Considering how quickly I normally finish this game, you're unlikely to unlock this class until the post-game, even if you were to meticulously plan things out to complete requests efficiently. Not to mention, some of these requests require you to watch character stories, or unlock a lot of job panels, both of which require you to have friends. So we essentially have access to 2 classes, and we'll get a third one in time for the final dungeon. This may not initially sound too bad, as you can only equip upwards of 3 jobs at a time, but it becomes an issue once we run into boss fights. See, we find Arya, but there's this mean robot standing in our way. This is Heidolanzer, our first real boss fight. With how easy Unicorn was, you might be wondering what makes this boss more difficult. Well, that would be the introduction of 2 major boss mechanics. The first is the break system. Bosses will almost always have 4 attack types that they're weak to. Hitting them with one of their weaknesses will fill up a break gauge related to that attribute. Once the gauge is full, the boss will be broken and take extra damage. Filling multiple adjacent gauges increases that damage further. There are other mechanics related to the break gauge, but we can't use them without friends. I can't really break a lot of bosses, though. See, our starting class only has access to slash and fire attribute attacks, and the mage class gives us access to ice and lightning attributes. That is 4 of the 12 attributes in this game. This isn't a major problem for Heidolanzer, as they're weak to slash, crush, ice, and lightning. We have access to all of those except crush, which would have been provided by Dianthus. The second issue would be boss special techniques. When a boss is about to use one of these, there will be a second bar on the screen that will be depleted by damaging the boss. Emptying these bars will either cancel the attack or massively lower the damage they otherwise do. It's important to drop everything when you see one of these, as special techniques are essentially an insta-kill if left alone. Like with the break gauge, these techniques are pretty easy to deal with when you have party members. They do, in fact, help with your damage output, making it much easier to deplete the bar. However, when you're on your own, the timing is very strict. If you aren't wailing on the boss, they are going to kill you. Even when doing my very best to keep on top of these mechanics, I ended up failing and had to deal with the US healthcare system. So I did more preparation before trying again, and I thankfully succeeded on the second try. By defeating Heidolanzer, we're able to rescue Arya, and she immediately gains 1 friendship rank with us. So, based on the rules we have, this challenge is impossible, all because Arya's stories are linked to completing the main story of Harvestella. However, the difference between Arya and everyone else is that her character stories will not provide any items until you reach her post-game stories. so I'll let Arya be our only friend. It's hard to avoid the Yuri in the doomed Yuri game, after all. And to anyone who says that you can play as a guy, thus making it straight, all I have to say is, why would I do that? Anyways, as we begin Chapter 3, we're harassed by this girl. I can't say anything about her without turning this into a multi-hour video essay about how phenomenal this game is. So, since we don't have time for philosophy, all that matters is she wants us to save the girl. You figure out what that means. We also find a fairy on our farm, and I'm sadly not allowed to ignore her. But she does help guide us towards our next quest of checking out all of the Sea's Light. This requires visiting the 3 other major towns and dealing with their problems. You can visit the towns in any order, but I'll be doing the intended order due to level requirements. As we enter the Njord Steppe, I have to do some party management as Arya has now forced herself into the active party. I should note that Dianthus left us after we saved Arya, so we're still in a state where the game expects us to have only one party member. The major difference, though, is that this party member is Arya, and let's just say that the entire game is built around having Arya in your party. She is the one forced friendship for a reason. Upon making our way through the Njord Steppe, we then have access to Nemea, the spring town. Apparently, some Heaven's Egg thing is now attached to the spring Sea's Light, and we obviously want to investigate. However, before we can do so, some dragons attack the town, and it's here where we truly fail the run. See, for this battle, Arya and our new party member Azul force themselves into your active party, which means you're required to have friends for this fight. This sucks because I had no say in this. Not to mention the fact that I know I could beat one of these dragons on my own. Still, I want to keep on going to see if there are any other moments where the game forces a party on you. Not to mention wanting to see if the rest of the game is even doable with these restrictions. So, we head over to the Heaven's Egg. At this point, dungeons are now going to start being longer, and they'll usually have a gimmick tied to their traversal. We don't get to see the gimmick of the Heaven's Egg yet, though, as we run into a monster that we can't kill. This is just an excuse in the story to introduce our next party member, Istina, the Shadow Assassin. Apparently, she can kill something in a single blow. I wouldn't know because I didn't put her in my party to refight the enemy. But now we can progress further into the dungeon. It's honestly not too difficult, as the gimmick here is riding the wind and finding key items to open blocked passages. As for enemies, most of them are really easy to deal with. The only real problem enemies are elementals, as they do a ton of elemental damage. That's kind of in the name. The issue here is that the fighter class I'm using tends to be better at tanking physical attacks than magic, so elementals destroy my health bar. Usually this wouldn't be an issue, as party members would take some aggro. Without them, I'm eating every single attack. Elementals are the worst enemies to deal with at this moment thanks to all their damage, but also because they're one of the few enemies with unavoidable attacks at the moment. So, generally speaking, I'm wary of elementals and either try to avoid them altogether or deal with them as quickly as possible. Still though, the dungeon goes by with little issue, and we eventually meet the dungeon boss. Oh, by the way, we're here in part to save Aesil's girlfriend, Tiela. A long story short, turns out she's a weapon. She's essentially the brain of the dragons here, and now we have to kill her. This is a fascinating boss fight where we have to jump between buildings to reach and attack Tiela. Of course, we won't be able to break her much, as her weaknesses are slash, piercing, wind, and poison. With only access to slash, we'll be doing pretty low damage to this boss. However, I think this boss is a good time to explain the 3 major attack types bosses will use against you. The first attack type is summoning reinforcements. This is something Tiela makes use of and can be difficult to deal with alone. Normally, multiple enemies would pay attention to your party members, making them more of a threat to your extra damage. Instead, they're now a threat to my health bar. The second attack type is a telegraphed area of effect attack. You'll always see them coming thanks to them lighting up danger areas with a bright red light. These are the least dangerous attacks as they always target the protagonist and are made to be easily dodged. The final attack type is the basic attack. They aren't really telegraphed and it's harder to dodge them. These attacks can come in sets of 3 and tend to be equally distributed among party members. With it just being me, that means I'm usually taking 3 people's worth of basic attacks. Since Tiella is a mix of enemy spam and AoE attacks, she's around the middle of the difficulty scale for this challenge run. But thanks to my previous knowledge of her attack patterns, she went down fairly easily. With Tiella dead, we have successfully completed Chapter 3A. That leaves us with 2 more Seaslight to investigate, so it's time we head to Shatola. Well, after I complete some side quests. It's a lot of walking from point A to B with the occasional battle, but doing these is nice for things like money and free seeds. This is still a farming game after all. You have to grow crops to make food to survive in dungeons. Anyways, once we actually reach Shatola, we run into a girl who meeps at us. The only logical course of action after that is to go to the bottom of the ocean to help her. Also, Howl Pendragon is here. More importantly, welcome to the Coral Shrine, home of the Sirens. They're kinda dead, making our new so-called friend Emo the last of the Sirens. As for the actual dungeon, it's one of the simpler ones to get through. The whole gimmick is hitting buttons, or whatever these are, to mess with the water so you can traverse through more areas. It makes this an extremely compact dungeon, so it tends to be a very quick endeavor. The only thing that causes this to stretch out are story beats that force you to wait until the next day, or make you leave the dungeon. And also Quietus starting up partway through. Yeah, I mentioned Quietus at the start of this video, and it's not just a story thing. It is a mechanic that is meant to hinder your work at the end of seasons. Despite being the season of death, you aren't actually hurt when going outside during Quietus, though that's an issue unique to the protagonist. We'll get back to that later. However, we don't have access to anything outside our farm, so we can only cook and craft. Well, cook, craft, and access the Quietus exclusive dungeon in our well. If you jump into the old well during Quietus, you gain access to Caranoid. It's technically the post-game dungeon, but you're allowed to start making progress during the story. However, I'm not down here to start making progress as I actually know how dangerous this dungeon can be right now. Instead, I'm here to fish. Don't ask me how much time I spent fishing throughout this run. I don't want to find out. After Quietus, though, we can finally deal with Lorelei, the boss of the Coral Shrine. She's honestly one of the easier bosses in the game, assuming you understand her gimmick. Because she's reliant almost entirely upon AoE moves, with a few basic attacks, you're not going to take a lot of damage. The issue is when she decides to use Capriccio of Death. This is a full-stage AoE attack, meaning you can't dodge it. And unlike most special techniques, you can't do anything to cancel it. Instead, you have to destroy the 3 bola that will be on the field. Each one you destroy will nullify some of the damage from Lorelei's attack. So, if you see this attack, drop everything to destroy the bola and you'll be fine. Otherwise, it will instantly kill you. I'm pretty sure party members don't normally attack the bola, so you have plenty of time to do this solo, which honestly makes this the easiest boss yet. Maybe outside of Unicorn. With the situation at the Summer Seaslight now under control, we're left with just the Winter Seaslight to check on. Issue is, it's protected by a religious order. And seeing as we're playing an RPG, that's very bad for us. As in, lands us in jail and will be executed kind of bad. We're fine though. We hired a mercenary and he's actually going to pull through on the job for us. Even if he can't protect me like I paid him to, because I can't have him in my party. Oh, the Pope's daughter also joins us. Don't worry about it. As for the dungeon I'm skipping over talking about, it's a nice physics dungeon. It's quick and it's boring. Just because Harvestella is my favorite game doesn't mean I'm unwilling to recognize that parts of it suck. As for the boss, it's the Pope. It turns out he's a monster, literally, so we obviously have to kill him. Kierkegaard isn't actually too hard, as he's similar to Tiela, where he relies on AoE attacks and summoning enemies. This boss is also mostly unaffected by my lack of friends, thanks to being weak to slash and fire. I sadly can't get a double break though, as the slash and fire gauges aren't adjacent, but being able to get 1.25 times damage is still pretty helpful. And even without break, my attacks do extra damage thanks to hitting a weakness. With Kierkegaard easily defeated, we then have to wait for the story to progress, but only after doing the unicorn side story. Thankfully, this is actual story and not the game forcing me to start the unicorn character story. Fun fact, the unicorn can be one of your friends, and I'm pretty sure that also means you can make him your roommate in the post-game. I don't want to investigate that thought further. With all the available story done, I do some farming and complete some quests before Chapter 4 finally begins. We end up having to wait a few days as Arya works on fixing a radio so she can bother the omens. Doing so is definitely not going to gain the attention of Weltgeist, who seems to be the one behind the Seaslight problems. Anyways, Arya gets abducted by Weltgeist. I make an attempt to save her, but Geist throws me off his airship. Don't worry though, I have the plot armor of all time. Seeing as he's now attacking the castle, I choose to investigate the place. Also, the game once again forced characters into my party, but this time I actually had the chance to remove them. Upon crossing the castle drawbridge, we run into Dianthus. I missed her. However, she won't let us in the castle, so now she's going to kill us to preserve our sanity. Thankfully, she's an extremely easy boss due to being a mage class. She basically only uses AoE attacks with the very occasional basic attack. The big issue here is that she usually likes to layer these attacks on top of herself. So using the fighter class can make this fight take a while if you want to play it safe. However, the mage class is actually viable in this fight. It'll allow you to attack from a distance and essentially ignore the AoE attacks. By defeating Dianthus, she gives in and chooses to be our guide through the Castle of Illusion. With this, we gain our final party member and are immediately punished for it. See, the castle is full of omens. Omens are usually weak to things like crush, sage, and lightning damage. This is done so you miss having Arya, as she's the one party member whose class can hit all of these weaknesses. And it makes sense because she is the main character of Harvestella. This is Arya's story. However, the game throws you a bone by providing Dianthus. As a Lunamancer, she has access to crush and sage damage. You know, the things omens are weak to. Not to mention her skills also debuff the enemy. The game really expects you to use her here, as the enemies hit hard. Not to mention that as you delve deeper into the castle, you start running into support omens who buff the enemy. If you thought it was bad that a handful of elementals can melt your health bar, get ready for a single buffed melee omen destroying it. Harvestella really wants to make a point of how important Arya and Dianthus are here, and it's killing me. Thankfully, it's only the melee type omens and the hornets that do a lot of damage, and both of them have pretty low health. As such, I managed to force my way through the castle. It took multiple days, but it's all worth it to reunite with Arya. I know this challenge is about having no friends, but Arya already forcibly made us fail that, and I can't just pretend I don't adore her. More importantly though, she shares with us that Geist is deeper in the Castle of Illusion as he plans to destroy the world, killing everyone living in it. What she doesn't tell us is that she's the Harbinger. Don't worry about it though, it's totally not ominous, nor does it mean anything for Arya's character arc. Gamers, I'm trying so hard not to talk about the game in depth, and it's really getting to me. Ignoring the ominous story that's being set up, we head back into the castle to go save the world. We only have one floor left after saving Arya, but it's a floor separated into 4 areas. Each area has a console you need to access in order to proceed. Each of these areas has their own little gimmick, whether it be doing a puzzle that's not really a puzzle, dodging lasers, or baiting high-level enemies away from doors that they're guarding. Thankfully, we've gained a lot of levels from our time in the Castle of Illusion, so it's a lot easier to survive the basic enemies while dealing with these gimmicks. Once we've accessed all 4 consoles, we can then confront Geist. Sadly, he's already put his plan into motion, and the only way to stop him now is by killing him. The boss fight starts off normally, with us fighting the same version of Geist as we did when trying to save Arya. This fight isn't really much to talk about. Geist stands in place, occasionally doing a basic attack followed by an AoE attack. You basically just smack him, run away, and repeat. Not to mention it goes by rather quickly when you can easily double break him with the fighter class. You know, for what seems like a final boss, this would be a major letdown. However, this is just the stat check. No, the real boss starts now. Geist's true form is much more punishing. His jump attack is now no longer an AoE attack, but rather a basic attack. Thankfully, he only uses this during his wind phase, which is really short. Once he switches to his water phase, he'll be really easy to attack as he essentially stands in place while only using AoE attacks. This is then followed by his fire phase, in which he dashes across the arena like Hydolanzer did. It's really hard to hit him in this phase with how much he's moving around, but he thankfully switches to his earth phase eventually, where he'll summon poison spots on the field just like Kierkegaard did. This makes it really difficult to traverse the arena, but it's a really good chance to attack Geist from a range. After going through each of the Seizelight phases individually, Geist will use Catastrophe. He charges up the skill by summoning elemental wormholes. You're on a timer to destroy these before he uses an arena-wide attack. By destroying the wormholes, you can make sure the attack won't kill you. Once Geist has used Catastrophe, he'll fight with all his elemental phases combined. This is where the battle becomes truly difficult, as each attack was fine on its own. However, now you have to deal with these stacked on top of each other. At this point, it becomes a fight of survival as you try to find an opening in his attacks, while also avoiding the dangers he may have left on the field. He'll also now use Catastrophe at regular intervals. This means you essentially have a soft timer. Either defeat Geist fast, or lose all of your healing because you can't do enough damage. However, this wasn't enough to stop me, even when I can't hit Geist's weaknesses for extra damage. With the Omen defeated, he recognizes our strength and provides us with something. A way to learn the truth. He also infects us with his meme. I swear, every person who has played Harvestella has posted an image of this line when they got here. But back to discovering the truth. We can use Geist's memory chip to access the pod we found Arya in at the start of the game. And this pod can then take us to some strange coordinates where we begin Chapter 5 passed out. Oh, hey, that girl's here again. With one of my favorite lines in the game. Just some casual foreshadowing. Anyways, as we step outside of this strange place we've found ourselves in, I'd like to say welcome back to Lost Gaia, or as we know it, Earth. And so begins Act 2 of the game, or as I like to call it, when shit gets real. As we begin exploring Lost Gaia, I just want to say that it really sucks not being able to do the character stories. Not because of helpful stuff we miss out on, but because I can't mess with y'all by showing you the moon landing flag. Yes, that is in the game. There is one really important thing that happens now that we're on Lost Gaia, though. We can now buy recipes to make level 2 repair kits and bombs. We can't make the bombs yet, but as we pass through the junction here, we will get the materials needed for repair kits. This is important as there's a door on our farm that requires one of these kits. Opening the door will give us access to the fighter's Echo Stone, which means we can now obtain the ultimate fighter skills. As for the story, we find ourselves in Phantasmagoria. In this theme park, we find a little girl, one who looks suspiciously like Arya, and she seems to be crying about missing her parents, which is similar to a story Arya told us when we were in jail. But that can't be Arya, because Arya's right here. Before we go help that girl, though, I think it's time we take a nap. And as soon as we do, Arya decides to stop being our roommate. I guess that solves the friend issue a little bit, but it still sucks. I liked having Arya around. However, she is going through an existential crisis right now, and I don't think rooming with a medieval peasant is going to be much help for her. Back to Phantasmagoria, it's essentially a long, winding path that likes to sort of overlap on itself. As a result, you have a lot of places where you can blow up walls or interact with machinery to open up shortcuts in case you can't do the dungeon in one go. And speaking of machinery, there are plenty of moments where you need to interact with the console to turn on a spinning cups ride so you can make further progress in the dungeon. There are also some mazes where their whole gimmick is that they're censored out of the minimap. None of these mechanics are too difficult to deal with, I just think the maze one is kind of cute. I know that's a terrible descriptor for a game mechanic, but I can't describe it in any other way. Is the maze a good mechanic? Probably not, but I think it's cute. Once we reach the end of the dungeon, we learn that this little girl we've been chasing after is a projection of Arya, specifically her memory of running away in this exact park as a kid. Who would have thunk? This is, of course, followed by a boss fight. Now, while the dungeon itself was rather easy, the boss fight is completely different. Starting with weaknesses, the Cruel Automata is weak to Crush, Lightning, and Sage damage. This is to say that the boss is weak to Arya. The Castle of Illusion wanting you to use Arya is not a one-time thing. Harvestella is a story about Arya seen through the lens of an outsider. There's a bit more nuance to it than that, but the point still stands. As such, the rest of the game after Chapter 3 is built around the idea of having Arya in your party. This means every single boss from now on will be weak to at least Crush or Sage damage, if not both. This leaves fewer slots that could potentially have a weakness we can hit. I should also mention that Arya is a melee fighter who deals pretty good damage, which means bosses either need a funky gimmick or a lot of health to counteract Arya's damage. So what does this mean for the boss? Well, it's thankfully weak to Slash, so that means we'll at least have a semi-decent damage output. However, it'll still take a lot of effort to take down the Automata due to having high health to offset having full weakness to Arya. Not to mention this boss also summons Arya illusions to attack you. One illusion won't kill you, but the boss doesn't stop at summoning one. As soon as there are multiple Arya illusions to fight, everything starts falling apart. Because now you have to deal with these enemies while attacking the boss and dodging AoE attacks from the boss that are actually kind of difficult to avoid in the moment. It might look easy watching this, but it is very different in the moment. Especially when these illusions would normally attack your party members. However, all of this combined is still doable. Is it difficult? Yeah. And it'll probably take a while due to my low damage output, but so long as I have the healing items to survive this, it should be fine. If only it stopped there. No, you see, there's one more attack from the boss. One I didn't know about until this run. After a certain point in the fight, the boss will begin a countdown. If they reach 0, that is instant death. I don't know if this is triggered by a health value or taking a certain amount of time, but I usually do this battle too fast to ever even hear the start of this countdown, probably thanks to always bringing along Arya. The moment this 20-second countdown started, I entered full panic mode because I didn't know what was happening. The boss had a decent chunk of health left, so I ignored the illusions and wailed on them. I just barely killed the boss right as the countdown ended. I know this game looks super easy and simplistic, but in that moment I could hear my blood pumping in my ears. It gave me the same sensation as when I successfully kill a scout in GTFO. Man, this video is only gonna be understandable by like 3 people to ever exist ever, huh? Ignoring the consequences my actions are having upon me, it's time to begin our climb up the Astrum Helix research facility. This is where Arya used to work, so it's obviously got the sick Arya lore. It's also the longest dungeon in the game. Well, maybe other than Caranoid, but that's the post-game dungeon with its own set of rules. In terms of normal gameplay, this is the only dungeon where you can't feasibly get through the whole thing in one day. I know that there are some dungeons you're forced to do over the course of multiple days, but that's more a limitation enforced by the story than it is by dungeon length. This is then exacerbated by the fact that we're doing this without friends. It was at this point where it truly began to register for me that having no party members makes dungeons so much more dangerous. When I felt like enemies did a lot of damage before, I mentally chalked that up to things like being too low a level or having a worse class setup than I usually would. But when you start dealing with enemies like these Aegis, the issue becomes too apparent to ignore. They're enemies that put up a shield as they attack someone. And in normal gameplay, you can usually very easily run behind them as they attack a party member to get indecent damage. Without party members, I have to run circles around these guys and wait for them to lock themselves into an attack before countering and then waiting for another attack. Okay, that's fine, I can manage that, but that only works when there's one of them. What if there are 2 of these guys? Or maybe even a group of 3? Well, in those situations, it's better to just ignore them. We have entered the part of the game where sometimes it's better to run away from groups of enemies. And these are groups that usually put up a bit of a fight for first-time players. I, however, have 100% this game multiple times, so groups like this are usually unremarkable to me. And that doesn't bode well for any basic enemies I would consider remarkable. This dungeon ended up taking so long that I ran into the next season of Quietus, and seeing how normal enemies have really started to become a hindrance, I thought this would be a good time to start exploring Caranoid. If you're wondering why I put it off until now, that's because enemies start at level 20 and increase by 5 levels every 5 floors. I used this as a chance to obtain some levels during Quietus, as I obviously am not allowed to visit the research facility. And I will admit that it was kind of helpful, as I've been falling behind a bit on experience. Probably because I've been running past a lot of enemies. Thankfully, this got me to level 50, which is around the level I wanted to be to tackle this hidden cave on the world map. There's a big level 50 enemy in here that I really want to kill. If you're wondering why, doing so provides me with a card key. This key then provides me access to a locked room in the Astrum Helix research facility. And in this room is a chest containing the broken katana. On its own, this item is worthless, but it could be nice for later. Back to the actual dungeon though, it doesn't take me too much longer to reach the top. And it was here when I thought about the fact that every dungeon that doesn't exist as a path between areas always ends with a boss. That is a very obvious statement, but the issue was that I didn't remember the boss, like, at all. So I was a little worried it would be hard for me just because I didn't know what I was getting into. And then I saw the boss and remembered this was the macrophage. What does that mean? Well, this is another boss that is completely weak to Arya. So obviously they gave the boss a bunch of HP to counteract Arya's damage, right? Right? No, instead it decides to put up 2 shields to nullify physical and magical damage respectively. How do you get rid of these shields? Attack the defenseless enemies in the arena that are powering them. The physical shield provider is weak to magic, and the magical dude is weak to physical attacks. But guess what? That doesn't even matter because they have barely any health. I am on my own and probably underleveled, and I can just obliterate these guys. There's got to be something difficult here. Maybe the boss's attacks? Nope, they're almost entirely AoE with a handful of basic attacks. Maybe they have an interesting special technique like the last boss or Lorelei and Geist. No, they're one of the bosses who get stunned if you cancel their special technique. This boss sucks. They're pathetic. No wonder why I forgot them. Okay, I'm calm. It was a nice break, all things considered. Plus, I said at the start of the dungeon this is the Arya lore dump location. I guess they were more focused on that than any actual difficulty here. So, for making it this far in the video, I'll give you a small taste of the Arya lore dump. This whole time, she thought she got caught up in a time disaster and was sent back to something approximating the Dark Ages. This is why she's really unwilling to admit friendship with us and eventually moved out of our house. She's worried about messing with the timeline. It's also so she can run away from her gay thoughts for the supposed medieval peasant we are, though you only get that if you watch all her character stories. As it turns out, it's the year 4108, according to the Gregorian calendar. For Arya, the year was 2078 when she passed out before then waking up in our house. Arya has been asleep for 2,000 years, and in that time, Earth has essentially died to this thing called Gaia dust. This is the exact same phenomenon as quietus on Regaia, which by the way is the name of the planet we started on. Because of this, humanity eventually abandoned Earth and created AI they call the Seth, which we've been calling omens. All you need to know about the Seth is that they exist to preserve humanity. So, where are the humans? They have to be us, the people living on Regaia, right? If only the game were that simple. Okay. It feels so good to get some of that info dumping out of my system. Anyways, saying the phrase, "let's go find the humans now," should make some sense. I hope. And to do that, we need to return to Regaia, enter the Castle of Illusion, and ride the space elevator up to a thing called the Orbital Cradle. This can clearly only end well. And by that, I mean it's time for a boss fight against a ton of Seth, because fuck you. This is probably my least favorite boss in the whole game, partially because it messes with me by being at the start of a dungeon, and also because these guys do so much damage. I almost died here, but thankfully I made it through, and that's the hardest part of the space elevator out of the way. Now we just need to climb up some scaffolding to get the elevator back online. And in doing so, we also learn about how the Seth built the Seaslight. They're massive structures that exist to essentially make Earth 2.0, hence the name Regaia. But with the elevator issue fixed, we can head to the Orbital Cradle and meet humanity. Though the Seth like to refer to them as Canes. And as I stated at the start of the video, the humans on Regaia are called Abels. Uh-oh. Well, that naming scheme is coming to its logical conclusion. With Quietus getting longer, the Seth only have the power to protect one version of humanity. Since the Canes are close to having to wake up, something has to be done soon. And Arya is the only Cane who we know is awake, which means she has to decide which version of humanity to kill. Welcome to Harvestella, destination ethical nightmares combined with a good bit of existential dread. Anyways, after messing around and figuring out that you can find the last plot twist for the game a few chapters early here, Arya leaves our party. She's hanging out in the orbital cradle now and is going to kill the Abels. It's fine though. As soon as I undoom the narrative, the wedding is back on. Of course, this means getting through the orbital cradle to reach Arya. To get this over with, it's a teleporter maze. The game is kind enough to label the teleporters as you go through them, so you're not really going to get lost. No, the teleporters are the easy part of this dungeon. The two real problems are the lasers and the enemies. I never explained the lasers in the Castle of Illusion, but tripping them will summon enemy reinforcements and lock the doors. You won't be able to escape unless you either remove all the enemies or use a return bell. Thankfully, that didn't end up being an issue for once. Maybe I was so scared of the enemies that I managed to clutch every required jump over lasers. So, what's got me so scared about the enemies here? Well, just like in the Castle of Illusion, most of the enemies are Seth. And again, we're without Arya. So the story intends for it to be kind of hard. Not only are we dealing with higher level Seth though, but there are a lot of Type 2 versions of Seth, which means they're a bit beefier. However, these Seth are manageable. I can fight them, heal, and then continue on my way. And even just running past them to unlock the next shortcut is viable. However, there is another enemy in the orbital cradle designed to mess with me specifically. Say hello to my worst enemy. They're so awful, I don't know how to pronounce their name, and I can't find a pronunciation guide for it. Now, the first thing you might notice is that they're a tank. So already you'd look at this in a casual playthrough and be terrified. Large, basic enemies like this are usually on their own because it takes the full force of your party to take one down. But that should be fine, considering I've walked past behemoths in previous dungeons. However, the most those guys could do was swipe at me, which barely slowed me down. These tanks, however, have the special ability to use a Gatling gun. It shoots you multiple times for a pretty decent chunk of damage and stun locks you in the process. And you're not going to dodge these attacks, that's simply not possible. So if one of these guys hits you, you better start praying. Now, you might think I'm exaggerating because there's usually a cooldown between enemy attacks. And you'd be right. If it weren't for situations where there's more than one of them. I was lucky getting through this dungeon solo without dying once. These guys are harder to deal with than the boss of this dungeon. Speaking of bosses, there is a midpoint boss. However, unlike the basic enemies, he is super easy. He's the same Seth we fought in the space elevator, but this time he has no friends, and instead of being a melee type, he only uses AoE attacks. It's honestly kind of pathetic, but hey, I'll take the downgraded boss over the tanks. Also, there is one great thing after fighting this guy. I do have to go a bit deeper into the orbital cradle, but we end up finding a door with a 4-digit code. The code is hidden on Lost Gaia, but I know it's 0726. Behind the door is a chest containing the old scabbard. With both this and the broken katana in hand, I can head back to Lost Gaia and speak with a hidden NPC. Handing over these items will fix the katana and unlock the Samurai class. The Samurai class is usually really exciting to have. It plays somewhat similarly to the Fighter class, but instead of using fire abilities and improving defense, it uses lightning and improves attack. Normally, this would be a really fun and useful class. However, the fighter's abilities to improve defense are vital to this run. Not to mention that because we just unlocked the Samurai class, it has no upgrades, and I don't want to spend what could be multiple hours getting the points necessary to make this class useful. So it's just sitting around and looking pretty as one of my equipped jobs. What's more important is reaching Arya. She's had an interesting clothing change, being edgy and all now. Anyways, she's gonna kill us now, and we can't stop her. This starts off my favorite boss battle in the game. It also has my favorite boss music. Go listen to Innocent Prayer after this. As for the actual boss fight, this is sort of the final boss of the game. However, that doesn't mean it's hard. It's actually not too bad, as Arya is a boss who uses basic and AoE attacks. And as we all probably know at this point, that's pretty doable solo. Not to mention that she's weak to the protagonist. You can easily double break her with the fighter's slash and fire damage. The real difficulty of this battle is listening to Arya's heart break in real time. I do jest though, this battle is actually pretty difficult to solo. Arya does a lot of damage with her basic attack, and unlike other bosses, her AoE attacks actually have the ability to pull you in. So there are times when you're fighting against forces pulling you into damage areas. Not to mention, Arya's the first boss whose special technique I couldn't cancel. I got the bar so close to depletion, but it wasn't enough and I got blasted. I almost died to that. In fact, I almost lost to Arya. I ran out of drinks to heal with, and you can't eat food on a full stomach, so that form of healing was out. So, seeing that I couldn't heal, I wailed on her and thankfully won. However, Arya is smart and has chosen to use a cutscene to kill us. This is a really impactful moment where we learn about the savior complex that was instilled in Arya from childhood. And then we run into this image. I just want to ask, do you guys think the game uses religious symbolism? It's kind of hard to tell. I do seriously love this moment, though. Arya is meant to be humanity's savior, while the protagonist is meant to be Arya's. You could say something about these two being soulmates, and it doesn't necessarily need to be in the romantic sense. But yeah, we managed to reach Arya's heart and remind her of her humanity. In doing so, she admits she doesn't want to kill anyone and calls off the plan to destroy the Abels. Geist is pissed, though. I haven't talked about him returning because all he does is yap. I think this version of him deserves to go in a blender more than his original counterpart. But having seen that we're the only one capable of stopping Arya, Geist has decided to hand all control over to me. If you've seen me play a Fire Emblem game, you will probably assume this ends badly. Honestly, that would be a fair assumption, as the game seemingly forces you to choose between killing either the Kains or the Abels. And you are actually allowed to choose either of these options, despite the fact that killing the Abels includes you. Going with either of these options gives you a bad ending. Technically, I could end the run here, and Arya would have been the final boss. However, that doesn't sit right with me. Instead, I chose to deny either of these options. By going through the dialogue with Geist properly, you can unlock the true ending of the game. For doing so, we learn that the Proto-Seas Light is alive and will destroy everything. Arya tries to sacrifice herself to save everyone, but we enjoy undooming the narrative here. More importantly, we now have access to the real final dungeon. The Stella Nursery combines the gimmicks of previous dungeons. This is normally fine and honestly not that bad to get through. However, doing it solo is kind of annoying. It's probably because I'm underleveled, but it's not great fighting the enemies. And fighting them on things like ice floors or damage floors is extra annoying. Thankfully, this is a very short dungeon, so it doesn't take too long to reach Gaia, the true final boss of the game. She is a 3-phase final boss, and she is the first boss since Heidolanzer to actually defeat me. See, her first phase is really difficult to deal with solo because it becomes a major stat check. The Gaia defense system will start out the battle by summoning 2 waves of enemies for you to defeat. At this point, normal enemies are the hardest part of the game, so this kind of messed with me the first time around. And not to mention that, after dealing with the normal enemies, you then have to deal with a proper boss fight. So after I failed once, I prepared myself for a second attempt, which is to say I made a ton of drinks. With more healing available to me, I tried the fight again. Once you've dealt with the regular enemies, the defense system uses basic and AoE attacks against you. These basic attacks are something to worry about as they're meant to be spread across 3 people. So, to be safe, I made sure I was always at least above half health throughout the entire fight. Keeping on top of my health was the only real change I had to make to my strategy in order to succeed. However, this was only phase 1. We still have 2 more phases to deal with before we can say this was a success. But on the other hand, the first phase is the hardest. Phase 2 is the dream of man's end. Just look at it, it's a typical RPG final boss. This phase uses almost entirely AoE attacks, so it's super easy to survive. The only real issue is that it takes forever, because the boss loves moving all over the place despite their massive size. Though I also learned during this run that the Dream of Man's End has a move kind of like Sephiroth's in Final Fantasy VII. It's obviously undodgeable, but it is survivable. I just wanted to point it out because this is the first time I've ever seen it. Anyways, this phase was easily defeated, and by doing so, we've won the game. You might be asking about what happened to phase 3. Well, after getting this cutscene that makes absolutely no sense because I'm not friends with, nor did I help any of these people, we begin the final phase where you actually fight Gaia. The thing is, it is impossible to lose in this fight. I don't even think it's possible to intentionally get yourself killed. And it's all because of the determination your friends fill you with. Or I guess the determination Arya and her friends give you? In game design terms, you're given permanent buffs that make you invincible during this fight. You still take damage, but you have a massive boost to your defenses, and you heal 999 HP every second. So, we obviously defeated Gaia and ended Quietus. As our reward, the girl who's been telling us what to do shows us our body. Yeah, this whole time we've been a Cain sleeping in the orbital cradle, controlling what some might presume to be the dead body of an Abel, which would explain why Quietus never affected us. But with the game over, I can now tell you that it is impossible to beat Harvestella without friends. The first reason is obviously because Arya's character story is progressed through the main story. This is completely unavoidable. However, you could make the case that Arya's story is allowed both because of this and the fact that it won't provide me with any items. But even if we were to ignore Arya, there was the one fight in Nemea that forced Arya and Asil into our party. So playing the whole game without friends is impossible. However, outside of those 2 specific conditions, the game is beatable with this rule set. And I'll be honest in saying that this run kind of surprised me. It was much more difficult than I expected, but it was still doable. Not only that, I actually beat the game faster than any of my previous playthroughs, which is honestly kind of wild. However, I don't think my work here is done. Since we already failed not befriending Arya, I decided to finish her character stories. Not only that, she's becoming our roommate again. Happy Pride Month. But the real thing bugging me is Caranoid. I want to see if it's possible to beat Caranoid without friends. So join me next week when I stream my attempts to beat the post-game dungeon and super boss all alone. I'll be streaming on Tuesday and Thursday at 8 PM Eastern Time like usual. This can only end horribly, and I'm so excited for it. But until then, have a good day, and maybe consider checking out the game if you haven't played it before. I did, in fact, leave out a good chunk of stuff in this video. If you want to hear me ramble about the game, I do so in the Discord linked in the description. And I'd obviously be happy to make more videos about Harvestella if y'all are interested. I just needed to talk about the game. And this was the best option that didn't involve me making a multi-hour video essay. But with all that out of my system, I'll see y'all around with my next stupid project.